Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I'm Parikshit Luthra. These are the top global stories we are tracking. The United States strikes a flurry of trade agreements with Japan, Philippines and Indonesia. Japan faces a 15% tariff instead of 25% proposed earlier. Nikkei rallies to a one-year high. Indonesia and Philippines face a 19% tariff rate. Prime Minister Modi embarks on a two-day visit to the UK to sign the much-awaited free trade agreement. The deal is expected to bring down costs of British cars and whiskey in India. Indian textile, gems and jewellery would become cheaper in UK. The Indian Union Cabinet has formally approved the deal. Israeli forces continue to pound Gaza. 10 Palestinians die from starvation in the last 24 hours. 109 aid groups call for action against Israel. European Union also issues a warning to Israel of action over worsening crisis in the region. Straight to the global market action. It's green across the screen in Asia after Trump inks a trade deal with Japan, Philippines and Indonesia. The Japanese Nikkei, Hong Kong's Hang Seng, Korea's Kospi and China's Shanghai all clocked gains on Dalal Street. The Nifty and Sensex ended over 0.5% in the green. Buying in large banking stocks helped the Nifty end above 25,200. Markets across Europe and US also saw gains. Our top story this evening, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is en route to the UK and is all set to sign a free trade agreement with his British counterpart Keir Starmer. This will be Prime Minister Modi's first visit to the UK since Keir Starmer came to power. The Union Cabinet has already cleared the draft of the long negotiated agreement. The deal, long in the making, is being described as a modern and comprehensive pact aimed at enhancing economic integration between the two nations. Sources say the agreement covers a wide range of sectors, with nearly 99% of Indian products expected to benefit from tariff reductions. The FTA is likely to give a strong push to labour-intensive sectors such as textiles, gems and jewellery, engineering goods, chemicals, auto components. On the services front, Indian exporters in IT, financial services, professional services and education are also expected to gain from improved market access and regulatory cooperation. The agreement is positioned as one that will benefit a broad base of stakeholders, including farmers, fishermen, MSMEs, startups and innovators. A key highlight of the pact is the gradual reduction of import tariffs on automobiles to 10%, particularly for futuristic vehicles under specified quotas. These reductions will be phased in over a 10 to 15-year period. The deal comes amidst rising trade between the two nations. Bilateral trade hit the $55 billion mark in 2024, a jump of 10% from 2023. Shifting focus now, US President Donald Trump has announced a flurry of trade agreements with Japan, Indonesia and Philippines after months of turmoil. These deals ease the tensions for some of Asia's largest manufacturing hubs. A deal with India remains stalled, and sources have said that any deal before the August deadline is unlikely. President Trump announced a deal with Japan that will involve the US imposing a 15% tariff. This is less than the 25% tariff announced earlier. More importantly, automobile imports from Japan will attract a 15% tariff. All other nations face a 25% tariff. This is crucial for Japan as automobiles account for 30% of all shipments to the US. Trump also announced that Japan will invest $550 billion in the US, largely in energy projects. Trump claimed that US will keep 90% of the profits from these investments without providing further details. The US will also reduce the tariffs on Indonesia. As per the deal, tariffs will come down from the 32% imposed earlier to 19% for the Philippines. The cut in tariff is minor. According to the deal announced by Trump, tariffs will reduce from 20% earlier to 19%. With this, the US has now signed a framework for trade deals with at least a half a dozen countries. A 3-month interim deal with China reduced tariffs to 30%. China is imposing a 10% tariff on US goods in return, but this deal expires on the 12th of August and US has already hinted at a potential extension. The UK faces a 10% tariff and Vietnam faces 20% tariffs. In a move that could ease the tensions between the world's two largest economies, President Trump hinted that he could travel on a bilateral state visit to China in the coming days. Joining me now to discuss the US-Japan trade deal further is Norihiro Yamaguchi, the lead Japan economist at Oxford Economics. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Yamaguchi. Let me start by asking you, would you say this is a fair deal for Japan?
I would say the conclusion was quite fair for Japan. Japan has been threatened with 25% by the US, but it turned out the deal was reached at the 15%. And what is important is that the individual product tariff on the auto product was also lowered to 15% from 25%. And this is quite important for Japanese economy because it is one of the most important industry in Japan.
How do you think this will help the Japanese automobile industry?
Right. So compared to the threatened tariffs and also the ongoing tariff rate of 25%, 15% is kind of reasonable. The Japanese yen fluctuate by this amount, and the Japanese auto industry have been absorbing this fluctuation in the yen. Sometimes it's favorable, sometimes it's not. So overall, I think the 15% for the auto industry was quite reasonable for.
The United States has so far announced deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan and Philippines. Overall, how will these deals rebalance trade between US and South Asia, and will the US really be a gainer?
Right, but the important thing to note is that the US-China there has not agreed yet. And also the US and the EU are still doing the negotiation. So with this in mind, probably the global trade policy uncertainty is likely to remain, which will limit the global economic growth.
How will these deals impact the trade relationship of Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan and Philippines with China actually?
So with China, I don't think there will be a significant impact in terms of the relationships. And what's more important is that whether China will increase exports to this country, because they are still facing the high tariff rate in the States. And if that things continue to happen, then there could be a diplomatic tension between China and other neighboring economies.
Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is likely to resign after his coalition lost majority in the election to the upper house of parliament. How does this impact the implementation of this trade deal?
Right. So actually, this US-Japan trade negotiations was his raison d'etre for being the prime minister, even after defeating. And now this negotiation has concluded. I think he will resign rather quickly, as early as in August. But the package is already signed, so I think this will stay there.
Considering the volatile political situation in Japan right now, who is likely to take over as Prime Minister, and is a general election close?
Yes, so the political situation is still quite unclear, and what was seen during the election was that the right-wing parties is quite emerging quickly. And with this in mind, probably the policy, including the economic policy, monetary policy, will move toward looser fiscal management, and also could make it more difficult for the Bank of Japan to impose any of the rate hikes ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Yamaguchi, with your views on how this trade deal between US and Japan is going to help the Japanese economy, and also the political situation and economic challenges for the next person who will be leading Japan as Prime Minister. A quick look now at the other headlines. The Indian government will resume issuing tourist visas to Chinese nationals from the 24th of July after a 5-year pause. The government had suspended all tourist visas to Chinese citizens in 2020 following the clashes in Ladakh's Galwan Valley. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson called the initiative from India a positive one. China had resumed issuing visas to Indian students and business travelers in 2022. US President Donald Trump has warned foreign pharma suppliers that they will face import restrictions if they do not lower drug prices. Speaking at a White House event overnight, President Trump said that pharma players in the US will face a lot of problems if they don't agree to cut prices. President Trump also claimed that his administration's policies will lead to a 1,000% fall in drug prices for Americans.
Drug companies were selling drugs, same company, in Europe and other places, based on what Europe told them to sell them at. And they said, let America pick up the difference, and I wouldn't let it happen.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the Trump administration is not in a rush to nominate a new Federal Reserve chair to replace Jerome Powell. Speaking to Bloomberg TV, he added that the process is underway, but it will be President Trump's decision. President Donald Trump has repeatedly called for Powell to resign, but has said he would not fire him. Goldman Sachs and BNY have joined hands to launch digital tokens that are tied to money market funds. Investors can now buy and sell money market fund shares on BNY's Liquidity Direct platform with a digital record of those shares created on Goldman's blockchain system. The two financial giants said that the move will enable seamless and efficient transactions without the friction that happens in traditional markets. Time for a short break, but coming up, as trade talks with Washington turn bitter, the European Union is weighing broader countermeasures. European Union diplomats signal growing frustration. Is a fresh trade clash looming? We discuss that with Abraham Newman, professor at Georgetown University. Welcome back. You are watching Global Lens. The European Union, South Korea and India are the large trading partners with the United States who are yet to strike a deal. The EU is facing 30% tariffs from August. India is facing a 26% tariff rate and South Korea is facing 25%. The European Union is now planning retaliatory measures to counter US's steep tariffs on the bloc. It is combining two packages of retaliatory measures into a single one that would target 93 billion euros of US imports into the European Union. This would include bourbon, airplanes and soybean. The combined list is likely to come into force on August 7th. This move comes as negotiations between the two nations have faltered in recent weeks. Joining me now to discuss this further is Abraham Newman, professor at the School of Foreign Service and in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's also the author of an article in Foreign Affairs magazine titled "Europe Must Unlock Its Geoeconomic Power. The European Union Needs a New Strategy to Defend Against Coercion." Mr. Newman, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Let me begin by asking you, what is the likelihood of a trade agreement between the European Union and the United States in light of the EU proposed retaliatory tariffs? Does a trade deal look absolutely unlikely now?
No, I don't think so at all. I think the threat by the European Union is really, it's a negotiating tactic. As we've seen in the case of Japan, with the Philippines, the United States wants to lower the maximum threat that it's imposing. And so they're just trying to reach a point where they can both agree. And it's really, I think it's very important for the European Union to stand up for itself and say, look, you know, you're raising the cost of doing business and we're not going to accept that. And so hopefully through that process, both parties will climb down the escalatory ladder.
Right. I'd like to ask you what Europe and EU is trying to do right now is impose an anti-coercion instrument. What's the precedent as far as this instrument is concerned? And would it be the strongest retaliation ever by the European Union?
So this instrument is new. It was created just in the last few years, really in response to coercion from China, or the threat of coercion from China. And what it does is that it allows the European Union to not just use tariffs, but also other market access measures to resist coercion threats. It would be unprecedented for the European Union to do it. For really, the European Union's DNA is about openness. It's not about closure. And so, to use this, what they call often the bazooka, would be quite unique. I think we're not going to get there, so I'm reluctant to speculate that it'll actually be used, but it would be quite dramatic if they turn to it.
Right. Do you think the way things are going, Europe will go ahead and impose this massive anti-coercion instrument on the United States?
Well, I think what we're seeing actually is that Europe is probably going to go a different direction, which is they're going to take the advantage that the United States is leaving open to them. So if you see what Europe's strategy right now is, it's about courting openness with other countries. That includes India, the countries that are part of Mercosur, Indonesia. Europe is basically seeing that the US is stepping away from the global economy, and Europe sees an opportunity. And so I think when we're thinking about Europe's strategy, it's more important to think of their offense rather than these kinds of defensive retaliatory measures.
Right. How do you think this trade war between US and Europe is going to hurt the United States, considering that while Europe has a surplus in goods in trade with the United States, US had a surplus in services?
Yes, I mean, I don't think that there's really a beneficial story to this set of policies that the U.S. is pursuing. It really just, increases the cost of doing business for the U.S. and for the world. I think what we're seeing is the U.S. saying, look, we supported the global trading regime for decades, and we're not interested in doing that at the same level. And I think every other country, whether that's India, Japan, the European Union, instead of kind of begging for a better deal, just has to recognize that for now, the U.S. doesn't want to play like it used to. And so I think it's better for Europe, Japan, Indonesia, India to really pursue openness for themselves with other players that are still willing to engage in the kind of the more traditional trade alliances.
Right. Now, you've written about the kind of geoeconomic strategy that European Union really needs for the future. What are some of the steps that you expect the EU and EU leaders, individual countries to take in order to protect themselves in global trade, diversify? Because currently, the US, with $1.97 trillion in trade in 2024, these were the largest trading partners in the world. They'll have to diversify now. What are the strategies available?
Yes, I mean, Europe is, as we say in this paper, it's an economic superpower. What it really lacks is the tools, the governance, the institutions to use that. The anti-coercion instrument is a first step, but in many places, they just don't have the expertise and the institutions in order to manage this type of conflict. It's not really what they were set up to deal with. They, as I said, the European Union structure was set up to deal with a world of free trade. And so what they really need are strategic institutions around sanctions, export controls, tariff management that will let them do that. And I think we're already seeing them engage in those types of reforms, building up an economic institutional infrastructure that can then let them leverage their market power.
Right. As we speak, India and UK are close to signing a trade deal. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister will be signing the trade deal tomorrow with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And this will now be a template for the India-EU negotiations, which have been taking place. And we hope to conclude this FTA by the year end. Do you think what's happening with the United States and EU's own diversification strategy will possibly speed up the process of negotiations and concluding a trade deal with India? How important will India be for the European Union now?
I mean, it's no doubt. India wins from this situation because right now the European Union is facing pressure both from the United States and from China And it is in a position where it wants to quickly sign a whole host of trade agreements with countries that want to move forward. And so I think it is going to be easier for India and the European Union to strike a deal, one that maybe is not so focused on previous concerns that held up the deal, like agriculture. And so I think you're going to see Europe open to a more kind of flexible approach, and one that will try to speed up these types of agreements. It's not a done deal. We've seen that with the Mercosur agreement. The French have continued to raise issues with that. So it's not that it's, will be easy, an easy process, but I definitely think that it will, what the US is doing will speed up those negotiations.
Right. Within Europe, which are the economies where you expect the highest impact of Trump's tariffs?
Well, what I think we're going to really see is what happens in the deal around autos. The German economy is a huge part of the European economy, and the auto supply chains that weave Europe and the United States together are dense and are really important for both economies. And so that will be the sticking point. What we saw in the Japan agreement was that the tariffs on autos were reduced just to a blanket tariff. If that happens, I think Europe will be able to absorb it. It won't be a big issue. But if you continue to have an excess tariff on autos, that could really hurt Germany in particular and Europe in general.
Right. But do you also feel that Trump's tariff strategy is now seeing diminishing returns? He won't be able to continue with these threats for long enough. It seems that European Union has also had enough, and things are at a tipping point now. Do you feel after the 1st of August, things will start toning down a bit as far as trade tensions go?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that the world is rebalancing to a higher level of tariffs around the United States. So yes, the threats, the highest level threats are not sustainable. So, 46% against certain countries or, but what we have seen is an acceptance by other countries to really historic level of tariffs. If you think about the UK, the agreement between the US and the UK allows for 10% tariffs. The recent agreement with Japan, 15% tariffs. The news reporting that I've read, Europe is willing to accept 10% tariffs. So I don't think we're going to have an escalatory trade war that leads to a breakdown in the transatlantic trade flows, but I do think we will see a U.S. that is imposing costs on its trade partners, and that its trade partners ultimately are willing to accept that. And that's why I think really the key strategy for these trade partners is to engage in more liberalization with each other. That's I think the offensive strategy of finding new markets when the U.S. is closing its market is really the best way for the global economy to move forward.
And Abraham, do economists like you believe that the current set of tariffs that the U.S. has imposed will stay even after Donald Trump leaves office?
That's a great question. I mean, I think what we've seen in the United States is that there's not a clear coalition in support of free trade. If you look at President Biden's track record, he did not negotiate any free trade agreements. He did not remove the tariffs that were in place on China that the first Trump administration imposed. It will depend kind of where we land in terms of the final trade tariff levels, but it is quite difficult right now in our political environment to remove tariffs. And so I think if we get at really destructive levels, yes, the next administration would. But if it's, these 10% tariff levels, it will be quite tricky once they're in place to get them unwound.
All right. Thank you, Abraham, for joining us on the program. Clearly, we're looking at a volatile situation between US and European Union, and let's hope they come to some sort of agreement and understanding. That's a wrap on this edition of Global Lens. But before we go, British heavy metal icon Ozzy Osbourne was the lead singer of Black Sabbath, has died at the age of 76. This comes just weeks after Osbourne reunited with his Black Sabbath bandmates and performed a huge farewell concert for fans. The self-styled Prince of Darkness was considered a pioneer of heavy metal, was known for his larger-than-life and sometimes controversial on-stage performances. We leave you with this tribute on Final Cut.